momentum and you're going to be a part of it, right? Okay, so let me get started. I'm going to talk to you about App Engine for Java developers. Very few slides, more of a discussion and more of code. So how many of you attended any of my cloud computing sessions, either at B.NET Takeade or at Eclipse Developer Summit last week? Okay, very few, very few. I have my Microsoft friends raising their hands for the Azure session, but primarily I'm a cloud computing evangelist. I'm very passionate about cloud computing. I play a lot with Azure primarily, and now I started to look at App Engine and also the Amazon Web Services. So what I'm going to walk you through is the classic thing that I actually talk to developers about. Because as a developer, when the very first time cloud computing term was hitting me, I had a lot of confusion on what exactly is cloud computing. So every time I do a cloud computing session, I basically divide that into three parts, right? One, I'm going to demystify what is cloud computing. Second, I'm going to talk to you about Google's architecture on how they implement cloud computing. Third, we'll actually get hands-on to really see what it takes to write a cloud computing application on App Engine, right? So by end of this session, you'll go back with a lot of clarity on defining what is cloud computing. And at a very high level, you'll have clarity on understanding Google's App Engine architecture. And I'll also show you how to write your first Hello World on App Engine, right? So three parts. Let me get started. Very first thing, most of us, when we heard the term cloud computing, we were not very sure. But I have to give you a prelude. I have to really walk you through some of the evolutionary concepts before we really get to the crux of cloud computing. I'm very passionate about distributed computing. The very first time when I saw Unix boxes talking to each other, it was very exciting. And then as a Microsoft developer, seeing two COM components talking to each other, COM+ or MTS marbles rotating in the console, then Java beans talking to each other over RMI, was very fascinating to me. So I have seen this whole evolution and I want to share the way it happened. So in early 80s, it was all about RPC, right? Remote procedure call, which essentially had machines talking to each other. RPC was a protocol to make machines talk to each other. And slowly the communication moved up in the stack and components or applications had to talk to each other, more of components. So we had componentization technologies like Microsoft Component Object Model, Java EJB, Sun's EJB, and then we had CoreBA. So many of these componentized architectures used to communicate with each other using protocols like DCOM, RMI, and IEOP. So this was moving the communication one level up and making components talk to each other. Slowly in 2000, we started to see the power of services talking to each other, or rather web applications talking to each other through a protocol called SOAP, Simple Object Access Protocol. And this literally made websites much more talkative, if I can use the term, because now you could have web application 1 and web application 2 talk to each other using standard HTTP and XML protocols, and that was SOAP for you. But SOAP was more or less a prototype, a pilot, to actually show that it is possible to have components talk to each other, scaling the firewalls, crossing the boundaries of an organization, the intranet and the internets of the world. So SOAP was more of a prototyping technology than the real world. And by the time the enterprise realized the power of the services, they started adopting what is called SOA, service-oriented architecture. So service-oriented architecture, if I have to visualize, if RPC is at the operating system level, service-oriented architecture is communication between enterprise applications. That is at the highest level of the entire stack. SAP talking to PeopleSoft, Microsoft Dynamics talking to XYZ application, using standard technique called SOA, service-oriented architecture. So this is real. This is where the investments are going on. You have a lot of products being targeted at these scenarios, like IBM's WebSphere, Oracle's WebLogic, and their Fusion middleware, to Microsoft's BizTalk, WCF. So all those things make SOA very realistic. And this is a technology that enterprises have been heavily investing in, and this has been a trend over a period of time. So if you actually look at the trend, it all started with operating systems and processes talking to each other, to businesses talking to each other, right? Now, going forward, we are not very sure what's going to be the protocol by which the applications, businesses will continue to talk. So we cannot really predict where we are heading to, but we'll try to derive some outcome out of the current trends. The other important trend that we have been observing is the way ISP has evolved, right? So when I was talking to Atul Chitnis, every time I meet him, I feel nostalgic because Atul Chitnis was running this pre-internet era bulletin board systems, where he was mentioning that his BBS server was running in his bedroom, which was like very, very scary, very funny as well. So from there, we have come a long way. But if you look back, ISPs have been the gateway to the internet. The very, very first avatar of an ISP was giving you a dial-out modem, which was making funny noises, which gave you at the most 28.8 kbps connectivity to internet. That was ISP 1.0. So who was an ISP? You go out and buy bandwidth from them. So that was BSNL, VSNL, and the local ISPs for us. From there, ISPs moved on to emerge as what is called ISP 2.0. So there, they started to host websites. So it's just not providing bandwidth, providing basic connectivity, but it's about hosting your web apps. And this fueled the .com boom and the subsequent burst in early 2000, where everyone fancied the idea of having a .com for themselves. Right? This saw the Silicon Valley startup boom around the web. So ISP 3.0 is more to do with real estate. Once the dust settled down, they started to look at leveraging the internet for larger things like enabling CRM, enabling Salesforce, and so on. And ISP 3.0 was more about basically co-location. You take your black box, you put it up in a data center owned by the ISP, and he would just give you rack space, he would give you bandwidth, and your mobile sales force can log on to your data center anywhere in the world because it's now on the public pipe, which is powered by an ISP. So from basic internet connectivity to hosting to co-location to something very interesting called the application service provider concept, right? This was again experimented towards the end of 2000. What I mean is this decade. So basically, you have seen a lot of ISPs offering you desktop on subscription. I'm not sure how many of you have seen, but Airtel recently came out with an offer by tying up with Nibio, who will give you a desktop on subscription. So you need not own a very powerful PC. You need not own any licensed software. You just need to subscribe. So you would get a device, and this device will be hooked onto a monitor, which will act as a display. You'll have a keyboard and mouse. The moment you switch on the device, it actually automatically connects to the cloud, the data center, and you'll start enjoying a session, a software session, which will have a desktop. And when you are subscribing to this service, you would say, give me Microsoft Office Professional because I do a lot of word processing and I do a lot of information processing. Give me Adobe because I do a bit of multimedia, and you can go ahead and subscribe to these levels of packages, and you're going to pay only for that. So that was actually the beginning of application service provider, where you don't own the software, you only start subscribing. But that actually branched out to what is called a software as service. And I can't think of anyone better than Salesforce.com, right? Most of us have seen Salesforce.com, where suddenly a typical application that's supposed to run on a desktop is now multi-tenant and it's multi-partitioned and put up on the web, and multiple organizations can sign up with a number of users, and you don't really run anything on premise on your data center, but you're outsourcing your entire Salesforce and CRM to Salesforce.com, which is an amazing way of actually running applications or typical software as a service. And Salesforce.com has been a believer of no software. In fact, their NASDAQ thing is no software, and their toll-free number is 1-800-NO-SOFTWARE. So Salesforce.com is very anti of shipping software on a CD or as an EXE. It's all about delivering the software experience over a browser as a service, right? That's where the world is heading to. Now, we haven't still defined what the cloud is, but that's where we're actually moving towards. The other very interesting trend, this is also touched upon by Pranav in the keynote, emerging standards for distributed computing, popularity of protocols like REST, POX, and JSON. No one thought that POX will come back. What is POX? It's plain old XML. This is what happens in the fashion industry, right? You have trends reversing and trends repeating. So at one point, we started to put up a lot of junk around an XML packet through the SOAP envelope definition and the web service standards and so on. Now people don't care about it anymore. You make a call, you get a plain old XML packet that you parse the way you want it, using any of the choice parsers, right? So POX is becoming very, very common. JSON, because of the AJAX and the Web 2.0 innovation, Today, the front ends of Ajax want to consume data natively. You don't want to deserialize data from XML to JavaScript objects and then consume it. So JSON is a wire format protocol that's powering the Web 2.0 front ends and the back ends. Bandwidth costs are very affordable, right? I know some of my friends who actually own bandwidth or the connectivity from 2 different vendors because they want to have fallback at home, right? And Airtel is offering 20 Mbps connectivity at home for an affordable price of some $2,500 per month, which is very, very affordable. And reliable connectivity, right? You go anywhere, you are connected on your mobile phone, on your PCs, so it's becoming very pervasive. The other of the trend is virtualization. Today, it's all about consolidation. No one wants to run a huge data center with hundreds and thousands of servers. It's all about consolidating servers to run virtualized platforms, which will basically help them manage the infrastructure better. Instead of hiring an admin for one data center or maybe a cluster of servers, I would actually have very few admins managing a virtualized cluster of servers. So that's actually enabling the enterprise to drive what is called as a green IT initiative, where you are reducing the consumption of power, the heat that the data center generates, and so on. So everyone is moving towards this. Actually, these trends have no connectivity with each other. They are not very relevant if you put them in one context. But all of these bursts of trends are contributing to what we call as the cloud computing, right? So now, let me get close to the cloud computing. I have been a web services developer. How many of you wrote web services in JAX, WS, or Apache Access 2, or ASPX, ASMX, WCF, any platform of your choice? Okay. PHP doesn't matter, right? So web services are very, very common. And the first time I heard about cloud computing, I was very confused, right? Because I always believed that a web service is cloud computing. Because what you put up out there is actually in the cloud, and you are sending and receiving something from the cloud. So I always assume that cloud computing is a glorified marketing term for web services, only to realize that it's not, right? So how many of you feel that web services are very closely related to cloud computing, or you feel they are exactly the same, they are synonymous? If you actually played with web services and if you have consumed web services, you know what I mean, right? That's the closest that we can get to as a developer. So it almost forms an illusion of sorts saying, yes, web services is equal to cloud computing, but it is not, right? Cloud computing is a mammoth. It's much more than a typical web service that you and me write. So before we really get there, let's take a look at what really powers the web service. At the bottom of the stack, we need a box, we need a hardware. And this hardware is consisting of a processor, it has storage, it has memory, and to talk to this resource, we need an operating system of your choice. I'm sorry, you cannot really see the block, except a block, but there's something written on it. Now, as you go up in the stack, you actually have operating system holding specialized services like a runtime, like a database, like a web server, and these specialized services need APIs to talk to. You cannot really talk to a database from the web app directly. You need JDBC, you need ODBC or OLADB or Java Persistence API, or you need something to talk to them. So you actually have the frameworks and the SDKs at the top, and they power the applications to basically consume the services provided by these operating system specialized niche services, right? Now, you can actually map this to your favorite operating system. It could be Windows, Linux, Mac, or it could be Java runtime, the JVM, MySQL as a database, Apache as the web server, and the SDK could be JDK or .NET framework. And at the top of the stack, you have basically the web app, which can be further broken into two pieces. One is the UI, which actually has the JSP or the ASP.NET markup, and the code that you actually write to process business logic. Now, this is very essential, and that's the way the frameworks have been moving. Today, if you look at Java server faces, that's what they do. They cleanly separate out the logic from the markup. ASP.NET has been advocating this for a while. So, assuming you're writing a web application to do something meaningful as adding two numbers, you call that a calculator website, you realize that you have written few lines of code that has to be consumed beyond the web. Maybe you are building a new desktop application which can leverage this application business logic that you have written. So what you basically do is you identify that part of the code which is reusable, and you put a boundary against it and call it a web service, right? ASP.NET developers do it by putting a web service or a web method attribute. Now, Java folks do it with an annotation which says it's a web service. So you are essentially identifying a block of the page that's reusable, not just by the web app, but by any other application which can talk to it over HTTP. That's exactly what web services have been. But web services are slightly different, right? So they are basically reusable piece of code which can be called over the web. Now, taking web services to the next level, this gets really interesting at this point. Now, we have been writing and consuming web services all through. But let's think radically for a while. All of us run PCs and servers and laptops, so on. But if we are actually connected to the web, why can't we offer certain radical services that are coming out of a PC, not a CRM code or not a scientific calculator code, but how about actually offering the core CPU processing, the memory and the storage as a web service? So instead of do calculate N1, N2, you would say do compute and a huge task that you are submitting. And this task is actually computed by my hardware, which is currently idle, right? So you're actually writing a web service, but you are not taking the responsibility of processing or writing an abstract logic. You're basically giving it to the processor, which will compute like any other instruction. So if you are able to put up an operating system which can accept instructions per second as a call and can process that, or if you actually put up storage and expose it as a service, and someone asking or requesting over the web saying, give me 2 terabytes of storage. Now, what do you call? Does this qualify to be called as cloud operating system? Why not? You don't believe? Let me tell you this. When Amazon actually got started in late 90s, they went overboard in buying their hardware. In 2000, with the whole excitement and whole Silicon Valley funding around .coms, Amazon really went overboard and invested in infrastructure that they never got to use, right? And they started accumulating these huge data centers which are capable of crunching umpteen number of instructions per second, and they're capable of running a huge enterprise, and that was lying idle. And it was a criminal waste for Amazon to keep it that way for so long. So someone in Amazon suddenly thought of this. Why don't we expose the unutilized computing power as a service? That's how a world's biggest bookstore turned into a web server or a cloud computing company. It was hard to imagine 10 years back that the world's largest online e-commerce company would become a cloud computing provider. But it's a fact today, and they're competing with the Microsofts and the Googles of the world. Amazon actually leads the cloud computing revolution. So what exactly did Amazon do? What was the magic sauce behind their success? They actually exposed their operating system capabilities as service, and they gave it a nice name called Elastic Cloud Computing, EC2. It's elastic because you can stretch it the way you want it. You keep feeding in more instructions, they'll actually span off more processes for you. That's elastic, and that's cloud computing. So it's essentially the processor plus storage plus memory offered over the cloud as a service. That's the Cloud OS, right? Now, it turns very interesting. How about other services? An operating system by itself is not very useful. Either you got to have a shell to submit tasks to it, or you got to run specialized services. So what happens if I take a combination of these two, which is like, for example, I take MySQL and the API to talk to MySQL, or I take JDK, JRE, and I offer it as a cloud framework. What does that qualify to be called as? Can I call it CloudFX or Cloud Development Kit? Why not? Because to talk to a database which is running somewhere, you would call an API running in a completely different location. And by the way, all these stacks can be technically, physically, logically, realistically distributed and federated all over the world. For example, my operating system could be running in Singapore. My database could be running in Sydney. My API to talk to this database could be running in a data center in North America, while my application is hosted in one of the local hosting providers. And I'm using completely federated model. So if you happen to host an application that's talking to these disparate parts of the stack, physically, geographically distributed all over the globe, it's a cloud application. That's exactly what Google Docs is all about. That's what Salesforce.com is all about. That's what is called software as a service, right? So if you're able to visualize this stack, you'll change your mindset of saying web services are cloud computing, which is logically somewhere true, but not in a realistic, usable fashion, right? By the way, the industry has coined very nice terms for these three layers: the Cloud OS, the Cloud FX, and the Cloud App. Let's take a look at that. So if you're a cloud computing enthusiast, you would encounter three terminologies very often. The first one is called infrastructure as a service, right? So infrastructure as a service, this is what Amazon or Akamai would offer. They don't care what platform you run. You basically sublease their hardware and you spin off Windows, you spin off Linux, or you spin off Solaris. They don't really care. They just give you a hardware platform. Amazon is a great example of that. And that's called infrastructure as a service. Now, what happens if you take infrastructure as a service and start adding a programming framework like JDK or .NET to it? Well, .NET or JDK are platforms. So now an operating system plus a platform combination is called PaaS, Platform as a Service. That's what Microsoft Windows Azure is all about. It's a platform offered to developers as a service. That's what Google App Engine is all about. Now, the applications that you build on top of the platform as a service is actually called a SaaS, software as a service, right? So as you go up in the stack, you actually start with infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and then software as a service, right? That's a new way of visualizing your computing stack. Now, how does App Engine figure into this scheme of things? Well, if you believe Google.com is the world's most available, reliable, secure, scalable website, how about running an application next to it and get all those attributes inherited to your application? The USP of App Engine is this: run it on Google.com. Get your application, run it on Google.com. You get to enjoy the same infrastructure, same attributes of the well-defined or maybe the best defined web app. That's what is App Engine all about. Now, drilling down further, to target App Engine, I got to be using one of the languages, either Python or Java. Now, if you are a Java developer and if you happen to use Eclipse, there is a fantastic plugin by which you can say file new Google App Engine and start writing code, hit a button, you're on, you go live. But the good thing is there is a 4 MB download that can emulate App Engine Cloud on your desktop. You don't need to really sign up and do a lot of round trips between the cloud and the desktop. Once you install the local SDK, you can actually get started right away, and that download is just 4 MB, assuming you have a valid JDK installation on your machine, right? It supports persistent storage with queries. There is a new query language called JDOQL, which is a Java data object API. It supports indexing, sorting, and transactions. Of course, needless to say, automatic scaling and load balancing of your applications. Integration with Google accounts. This is another fantastic thing. I need not worry about personalization and membership. That's my biggest worry as a web developer. Now here, I just go ahead and integrate with the Google's authentication engine. So how do I validate my user? Well, I just outsource it to Google's account authentication. I did not write my code because it may be flawed. So I just reuse that, and I can query the user's profile by getting a user object that's given by Google directly. And cloud computing is all about spanning off asynchronous threads, right? I submit a job, I come back after 2 days, and I assume my job to be done. So there are scheduled tasks for triggering events and for offline processing. And the good thing, There is no upfront cost involved. It's free to get started, and you got to pay as you go. So fantastic model for startups where the cost is prohibitive to get started with, right? So I can literally start with App Engine, and when the holiday season comes up, where my e-commerce site is doing extremely well, I log on to Google App Engine dashboard and I'll pull a slider saying, App Engine, give me multiple cores, scale me out to X number of machines, give me so much of memory, give me so much of bandwidth, and I pay only for that. It's almost like subscribing to ESPN Star Sports during the IPL season, and then you don't need it anymore because the cricket season is over, and you unsubscribe to that package. Right? That's the facility Google App Engine gives you to basically enjoy the utility computing paradigm. Right? You go ahead and sign up for what you want. Nothing more than that, nothing less than that. So some of the design motivations, it's built on existing Google technology, integrates really well with existing Google infrastructure, provides an integrated environment right from design, development, testing, debugging, and deploying. Everything is very well taken care of in terms of the experience. Maintains very tight isolation between applications. So one faulty application cannot crash another Google App Engine application, or it cannot interfere with the core application architecture of Google. It's all about statelessness, because cloud computing, you never know which server is going to basically come back and serve you the response. So it's very, very stateless, and it requires partition data model. So I'll come back to this slide in a second, but I want to pull up Eclipse. Guess I kept it open already. Okay. So, so here is a very simple application that I have built. Actually, I built this application on Azure. Then I ported it back to App Engine. So most of you, how many of you use Eclipse? Great. So if you use Eclipse, all you got to do is just go to Eclipse preferences, or maybe it's actually not preferences, it's software updates. The very first thing, right? So you click on available software, and you got to add the Google update for Eclipse. So once you have this, you will end up installing the Google App Engine and the plugin for Eclipse. This is the very first step. Now, once I do that, by the way, it takes very less time to basically install that. And once you have that installed, you can save file, new project, and just like a J2E application, now you would see Google with web application project as a template. You go ahead and say next, and here you can create a new project with an option of using the Google Web Development Kit, or it is based on the Google App Engine. So this is where I basically configure my web application. So once I do that, it creates a structure. So here I have a simple social networking application called Simple Tweet. And let me walk you through the code here. It's very, very simple. Now, what is different from a classic J2E application or a Tomcat project? So here, within the SRC directory, you would see a package, a classic Java package. But you would also see what is called derivoconfig.xml. So this file is required for configuring App Engine's data storage capabilities. Right? So this is the file that basically tells what database the App Engine is going to talk to. So that's very, very new. And then you would also see the App Engine SDK, which is picking up the customized JVM and the jar libraries from the local file system. Actually, the JDK and the servlets, the JSP code that App Engine runs is slightly customized and tailor-made to run on App Engine. So you got to include all these jars. But fortunately, when you say file new Google App Engine app, it automatically includes all of that for you. And then there is a classic JVM that's anyways included. And then you have the workhorse of your project, which is coming into the var folder. And this is where I have my simple default.jsp. So let me first run this application, and then we'll take a look at the code. So my App Engine is actually starting up, and It's currently listening on localhost 80. So let me get Firefox and type. So here I basically get the home page. I have to sign in, and I'm going to sign in using my Gmail credentials. And once I say login, so this is like a very simple Twitter kind of an application, and this is actually running on App Engine. So now it's time for us to go back and take a look at the code. So what do I do here? It's very simple. Let me open up default.jsp. Apart from all the imports and all that, let me just walk backwards. So for now, your interest is actually in this. So I basically put up a simple HTML, and I post my tweet to a servlet called simple tweet. And let me open up the servlet for you and show you what I do there. So in this class, I just get the post request, and the moment I get the leak on the status message, I basically create an object called tweet, and I persist it. And how do I persist it? I call a persistent manager framework, which acts as a double-sided sticker between my actual servlet and the database. So this basically insulates me from any other database. So here I get the persistent manager framework, and I persist my object, which is T. So here, if you look at the tweet class, it's very simple. It's a simple class with a couple of getters and setters, and I annotate this class by saying it's persistence capable. So I'm turning this into a serializable class, which will be eventually stored in a platform called Data Nucleus Access Platform, which is built on, which is running on Bigtable, gives you a programmatic way to persist and retrieve data, right? As simple as that. So at a high level, I'm submitting a tweet request to a servlet. The servlet will extract the parameters and will do an ORM mapping to an underlying table, as simple as that. And my persistent management framework is pretty neutral. It remains the same irrespective of what you use. This acts as a helper factory between your servlet and the data store. So that's all I do there. And then I come back. I also do something useful. So what I do is I basically try to authenticate the user by calling the user service.getUser. If the user is not authenticated, I throw the sign up page. Otherwise, I go ahead and print all the tweets using the generics in JDK. And finally, I put up a sign out link somewhere here. So I'll say create login URL, and I give the URL there. So basically, that provides me with a sign out option. So let's go back. And here is the logout. So when I click on logout, it takes me back. And I haven't really done anything to enable this. It's all coming from the App Engine capabilities. So now it's time for us to go live. So I'm going to open up another tab, and I'll type appengine.google.com. So now I'm already signed in. So you would see I have two applications created here. Let me click on Janikram MSV application. So here you would see I have a dashboard, and I have the complete control over how my cloud app is going to look like, right? So now I'll come back to Eclipse, and it's time for going live. So I'm going to open up a configuration file called appengine-web.xml, and here I'm going to put my application ID, and this application ID is what I registered with App Engine on the cloud. And I just hit the glider button there. It's very symbolic because a glider is on the flight, you have no control, and someone has to control it remotely. So it's very symbolic there. So now I'm going to enter my password and say deploy. So in a second, you would see that it's going to deploy my application, and we'll go live. Okay, cloud computing can never be so simple. I mean, so deployment is successfully completed. I'll go back to Firefox, another tab, and I'm going to type janakiramsv.appspot.com, right? So that's my live URL. Now, carefully watch what's going to happen when I click on sign in. The moment I click on sign in, I actually see the Google authentication engine. Oops. Okay.
Scroll right.
Sorry?
I think you are fine. Just scroll right.
No. It's saying it's not affiliated. So it's some cookie issue. Let me open up another browser and try it here. So there we go. Hopefully this should work. Okay, there is some problem with my cookie, but actually what happens here is I get to see the Gmail account sign-in box. So the same frame that you see when you're signing up for Gmail or Google accounts, that will pop up, and this is where you're going to see the Google authentication in use. So from there I can get user credentials, his profile. Basically the whole user profile and personalization engine is inherited from Google. I don't need to maintain it, right? So
can you try moving the window to the left?
Okay. All right. I don't know why it is. Okay.
The project resolution.
Yeah. So it's a resolution issue, and I didn't say a scroll bar, so I was not assuming that. Okay. All right. So this is actually live. If you notice, this is on the cloud, and right. So this is as simple as going live, and you can actually see people signing up and trying to put up their post. So very, very simple. What I basically covered is how do you write a cloud application and also integrate with the data store, right? Lack of time, I cannot really drill down further, but I want to pull up my slides back and show you. Okay, so this is what happens to a hardcore Microsoft Windows user who just switched to Mac. Okay, so if you look at the big picture of App Engine, you have multiple front-end servers, multiple application servers, and your request can be delegated to any of the servers. So you have no control over it. So finally, what happens is when the front-end actually gets a request, the app master takes over and figures out which app server or the web server is actually idle, and it will branch out the request to that. And the same thing happens on the data store. And if it is static file, it is served from a different box. So we can actually spend 1.5 hours just going through this slide. I'll come back to you on App Engine under the hood session very soon. That's where we are going to drill down into each of this and actually see it for ourselves. It's a fantastic architecture and manages a load balancer blog by the Google App Engine team. Subscribe to it and you'll see a lot of updates. That's my website and my mail. Feel free to get in touch with me. We'll keep talking to you through the GTEG monthly meetings. This is just the beginning. So we'll come back to you for a session on Google Wave. So now I'm going to conclude my session.